When thoughts shut up, we can give ourselves to the experience from which poetry is born. Silence. And this silence is born of our lives. The morning, the evening, the tree from which they rise, and then the leaves that carry it over the meadows that we have not yet stepped on. This is our poem, music that exists in us or without us. That's why I have never felt that I'm the one who is creating poems or that they're mine. For me, poetry, spiritual experience and a moment are one. Something that lives before words, the invocability of a flower, place in which the cloud floats. And when I move my hand to you, poetry is ahead of us, before the movement, before the purpose, in some kind of nudity, pristine and peace. Poetry is inner solution when parts disappear into the whole. Something that is at the same time where distance, but irrevocably here, streaming off wholeness and emptiness, openness, which breathes for them. A reality that is very thin and unattainable when it is covered by the thick layer of the fast time we live. And penetrating in words requires the courage that poetry has if the mind doesn't distract us. I therefore believe that the imagination that creates the thoughts with which we travel to the past or to the future is an obstacle. Poetry flows through a human's life and breathing. So every effort to create it with the mind from which the imagination originates is what needs to be overcome. This is what poetry teaches us: unity, freedom, passion, peace, dance. This is a meeting with our being. So, how to write poetry if you are not poetry, if you're not love? That's why, to me, poetry and experience are one. The way you live, the way you look at the world, the way you travel through every moment. When a poem is written, you realize that words are not the sun, they describe. I'm even no longer a poet. Everything becomes poetry. I am poetry. Poetry, cosmos, and experience of life are one. There's no ballet dancer anymore. There's just ballet. There's no painter. There's just painting. History shows that key topics for the genuine development of humanity were written in poetry. The poetic language captures what a logical mind is not able to capture through the prose, or to lesser extent. Poetic is the domain of the unknown, hidden, but fundamental to the development of our awareness. So, it's no coincidence that when I was experiencing the first spiritual experience as a child, poetry was my closest language. The poetic language is the language of our inner world. When the mind is trapped in an illusion, our being urges us to step from the controlled to the unknown and free to poetry. I was 4 years old. I haven't been able to write and read yet, but I spent hours with books in my hands, observing and trying to understand strange things, strange forms inside. The thicker the book was, the more I liked it. I remember the first time I opened a book and then something happened in me. I didn't know what the words were. They spoke to me with something inside them, something which stood before their meaning. And that was energy. I started cutting them out of books and putting them together in my own way because I felt they weren't sorted out correctly. And when I learned to write and read, I began to write down poems which I before just recited. I wrote every letter with a different color. And my aunt was bringing me paper from work because I used up so much of it. I won't forget when my other aunt lent me her orange typewriter because we couldn't afford it at home. That's when I wrote my first book. I think it is essential that young people focus on their inner world. Everything that is written is merely a consequence on the individual awareness development. Writing should not arise from the desire to write. Writing is what lives and breathes through us. Desires destroy what is essential in poetry, unconditional love. So don't be in a hurry when writing. Enjoy it, but be self-critical at the same time. Knowledge is important. You don't become a ballet dancer overnight, but don't forget, knowing the craft isn't enough. What's essential in a craft is your authenticity, which flows inside you as spirit and cosmic energy. You cannot learn that by any craft, so don't manipulate and build poems like a bricklayer. Let poetry pass through your spirit and body first. You will do the craft's corrections afterwards. The writing world has a lot of obstacles. We are all part of the system, including writers. That's why it's essential to listen to yourself, to your being. Often madness and courage are needed, but that is all what we really have. Connection with the unknown, which remind us that knowledge is limited, intelligence is limitless, when poetry simply loves. Alive has always been the author of my inspiration. A good poet is always a good observer. Mission of poetry is to spread the light or the darkness of the crevices. It is therefore so important that we get to know both illusion and truth. It is the only way to gain the value of our observation. To carry wisdom means to lift your life. It's true. I have read a lot as a girl. We had a lot of books at home, and that was an important playground for me. However, I have never had authors who would have bigger impact on me than others. Every content brings beauty, if we found it, and we can learn a lot from all types of texts, good or bad. Poetry lies everywhere and nowhere at the same time. If we do not recognize it in us, how we will be able to admire it in the outside world? 15 years of experimental poetry has meant to me a form of artistic expression with which I was creating experimental poetic projects. It was a very wild time. In time of loud media, I wanted to give people deep and innovative poetic experience to touch their poetical essence and lead them to the unknown. For example, people's path through the streets were unexpectedly changed by the strange birds' houses, named after the poets and with the headphones added. By pressing the button, they could listen to poetry instead of bird singing. The next example is project Poetry Notice. When you do a wrong parking in Slovenia, you receive a brown note on your car window. So I made identical polyvinyl bags, just in different color, and instead of a bill, there was a poetry note inside. And then also the project One Scope of Slovenian Poetry, Please, which brought ice cream with poetry. Visitors were able to choose between different scopes made from paper tubes. We were offering a love scope with love poetry, a modern scope with the poetry of the modernists and other innovative tastes, so that people were able to know different poets. At that time, more than 1,000 similar projects were made. Their essence arise from everyday life, as I said. Poetry is everywhere, and I wanted to show it more clearly. I named these types of projects poetic situations because people were encountered with poetry on the street in a new situation that they started to co-create. Today, an experiment of poetry means something completely different to me. After all, the artistic projects transform a human being, as everything in life does. Poetry experiment is always an experiment of our own being. It's an experiment that's never finished. An experiment where you're in constant contact with the universe and the existence which teach you in a different way as school system does. That's why this poetry experiment is so beautiful and gentle. It's the only experiment that can't be repeated. Today, the poet lives and creates in time, which is changing very fast and is irrevocably politicized. Therefore, poetry is expected to remain even more in its old service, to detect and interpret the management of human lives, ethic, morals, values, and language. Because of that, the responsibility of a poet is even more important. If we listen to our souls, poetry and love are always within us.